Forgot to unmute myself there. Good evening, everybody. My name is Patrick Brady, and we are very pleased to welcome all of you to this evening's conversation with Ellen L. Weintraub, member of the Federal Election Commission. As I'm sure many of you in the audience already know, the Institute of Politics at UNC Chapel Hill is a student-led organization that works to promote student engagement in politics, public service, and civics more broadly here on Chapel Hill's campus, but also at colleges in North Carolina more generally. So to that end, we are excited to be speaking with Ms. Weintraub this evening. And so we are going to turn it over to her. Ms. Weintraub, if you could tell members of our audience a little bit about yourself, how you came to be in the position you are, and a little bit about the work of the FEC to get us started.
Well, thank you very much. I just want to make sure the technology is working. Can you hear me?
I think you might be muted, or your microphone might be off. There we go. Sorry about that. Yes, ma'am. There we go.
Okay. All right. There we go. It usually works. Well, anyway, hello. It's nice to see you, and it's a pleasure to be here. The Federal Election Commission is the federal agency that was set up in the wake of Watergate to follow the money, to make sure that the American public is informed about where the money's coming from and where it's going, who's supporting which candidate. Every story that you read in the newspaper about how much money the candidates are raising and who's supporting which candidate, all of that comes from the data that the political committees and the candidates and the super PACs and everyone who's spending money in politics reports to the FEC, and we make it public on our website. I'm a lawyer. I've been in the private sector, I've been in the public sector. Before I came to the FEC, I was working at a law firm specializing in political law. Before I did that, I worked on the Hill, so I got to know people on the Hill. The way people get appointed to the FEC is that we are nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate. So I was in the political law biz. I was known to people in Congress from my work on the Hill, and I was nominated in 2002 by President George W. Bush. I'm a Democratic appointee, so the way things work, I was recommended for the Democratic slot on the FEC by Tom Daschle, who was then the Senate Democratic leader.
And then can you tell us a little bit about some of the enforcement mechanisms at the FEC's disposal to actually do the work that y'all are charged with doing?
Sure. So we are a law enforcement agency. We are a civil enforcement agency. We have exclusive civil enforcement responsibility for the Federal Election Campaign Act. We have subpoena authority. We have a staff of roughly 100 people, I think, in our Office of General Counsel. We also have auditors and investigators, and analysts. And, anybody can file a complaint with the FEC, and our lawyers will take a look at it. They will make a recommendation to the commission as to whether we should pursue it, investigate it, settle the case, or dismiss it. And then the commission will vote on what they want to do.
But I understand that voting with the commission is a little difficult now because y'all are short of a quorum. Is that correct?
That is correct. We are supposed to have 6 commissioners, and right now we only have 3. And by statute, most of our important decisions as to whether to launch investigations or settle investigations, conclude them, issue fines, engage in rulemakings, offer advice in the advisory opinion context, all of that requires 4 votes, and we only have 3. And that sad situation has actually been going on for most of the last year. At the end of August of last year, we had been down to the bare minimum of 4 for a couple of years, and a third commissioner decided to resign from the commission at the end of August of last year. So we didn't have the quorum for a number of months. We regained the quorum briefly in June when a new commissioner was appointed. But then by the end of the month, one of our commissioners decided to leave. A different commissioner decided to leave. So now we're down to 3 again.
But y'all are coming up on, you know, what looks to be a pretty busy campaign season here. November is right around the corner. How do you foresee that really impacting the role of the commission over the next few months?
Well, yes, the election is well underway and people are raising and spending gobs of money. And fortunately, a lot of the work of the FEC is done by our staff and doesn't actually require a vote of the commission. So when people file their reports, our analysts go ahead and analyze them and send out requests for additional information if they think there's something missing from the reports. Our IT people make sure it's uploaded to our website. So the information aspect of our job continues on, and the public will continue to have the benefit of that as we go into the election. What we can't do is resolve enforcement matters or provide guidance. So if people have questions about not sure how to comply with the law, they want the advice of the commission, they can't get that right now. Somebody files a complaint, it's got to sit around and wait until we have 4 commissioners to vote on whether to instigate an investigation or conclude one or dismiss it or whatever we decide to do. Now, there are quite a number of investigations that are ongoing that were authorized before we lost the quorum, but at a certain point, all of those investigations will be concluded and there will be reports sitting on commissioners' desks waiting, well, our virtual desks, waiting for us to take a vote. So it is not ideal. We can do some of our functions, but enforcement, I think, is the part that really suffers.
Yeah, certainly. And then you've mentioned, you know, the commission has not been at full capacity for a number of years now, and has been missing even a quorum, you know, off and on for the past year. What does that indicate to you about the federal government's commitment to actually enforcing the campaign finance legislation that they have already passed?
Well, I think it's a broader problem than that. There are a lot of positions that are not filled in government right now. So I don't know how much to take it personally that, you know, it's not just us that are operating with less than a quorum. So it could be an indicia of a broader problem than just what's going on at the FEC. But it certainly doesn't seem to be a priority, given how many months the situation has dragged on. And there have been names forwarded to the president or suggested by the president. The president has issued an intent to nominate an additional individual, but it hasn't gone beyond that stage. Usually that is a predecessor step to actually nominating someone, and then once they're nominated, they could have hearings on the Hill and get confirmed. But, you know, we're at the very most preliminary stage of that.
Absolutely. And I know, you know, from following your own Twitter account, there's been a fair bit of discussion about foreign influence in U.S. elections, both in 2016 and upcoming in 2020. Given that there have been a number of federal investigations, you know, both administrative and congressional, but also seeing that foreign influence can be construed as a thing of value to a campaign, how does the FEC fit into that investigative landscape in that particular context? And what kind of work is already being done by the FEC in that space?
Well, as I said, we have exclusive civil enforcement authority, but the Justice Department also has enforcement authority of criminal violations of that aspect of the law that prohibits foreigners from spending money in our elections and prohibits anybody from soliciting, accepting, or receiving foreign money in connection with a U.S. election. And that is the one area of the law where we have jurisdiction at the state and local level. It's not just at the federal level. So we have a number of investigations ongoing. We have a number of complaints that are pending right now. And as I said, some of the investigations are ongoing. Some of the complaints are waiting for the commission to be able to make a decision on them. And in any event, often complaints are filed both with the FEC and with the Justice Department. So it's possible that there's also enforcement action going on at the Justice Department.
Absolutely. And then something else I know you've been following pretty closely and commenting on pretty widely on Twitter as well, is the president's comments that he's got a good bit of trepidation about the number of mail-in or absentee ballots. He likes to make a distinction, though I know many people do not really, that the number of absentee mail-in ballots this year opens the door to a good bit of election fraud. How do you respond to those comments?
Well, as you know, I have looked into this issue, and there have been any number of studies of the issue of voter fraud. The myth of voter fraud persists. A lot of people are firmly convinced that it's out there and it's rampant, but in fact, when people study it, they find that it's actually quite rare. And there have been a number of studies. The Justice Department looked into this in the Bush administration. The president put together a commission at the beginning of his administration to try and look into voter fraud. It disbanded without any findings. And all of the studies have shown that voter fraud is exceedingly rare. It is a little bit less rare in the mail-in setting, but it's still exceedingly rare. The Heritage Foundation, for example, maintains a database where they are looking for examples of voter fraud. They're trying to find examples, and they have found over the last couple of decades, out of billions of votes cast, 143 instances of fraud in connection with absentee ballots. So it's not, if one were doing it as a percentage, it would be I don't know, 4 or 5 zeros before you'd even get to a number. It's a very, very rare problem of voter fraud. And indeed, it doesn't really make sense as a crime, because people would have to, they'd be risking jail time, usually just to change a vote or two. So it's not a rational crime for anybody to commit. And indeed, most people don't do it. There are mistakes sometimes. People make mistakes. So, I've heard of instances where somebody had 2 homes, and they thought, well, if they only voted at the national level at one of their addresses, they could still vote in the local races at their other address. No, you gotta pick one. You can only be a voter in one jurisdiction, not in 2. But that's, sometimes people will, I've heard of instances of somebody saying that, well, my spouse passed away right before the election, but felt really strongly about this and really wanted to vote, so I cast their vote for them. I mean, things like this do happen. They're just incredibly rare, and usually it's because people are just confused or voting in error. So I really do not think that this is something that people need to worry about. And indeed, I think the larger concern is that because of this misconception that there is voter fraud out there, a number of jurisdictions have adopted restrictions that make it harder for people to vote. They make people jump through a lot of hoops in order to register to vote, in order to exercise their right to vote. And that, I think, is the bigger risk, that you end up disenfranchising people because of all of these extra steps that need to be taken.
So you've mentioned that most instances of voter fraud typically occur, just people are confused about what the rules are, or they weren't really sure, how to go about casting their ballot. If someone were to intentionally endeavor to cast a fraudulent vote, what kind of safeguards exist to prevent that from happening?
Well, in the in person, obviously you show up in person, and people are looking at you, and you've got to sign and verify that under oath that you are who you say you are, and in some jurisdictions you have to show an ID. In other jurisdictions, you just sign, and they ask you. When I go to vote, I don't have to show an ID, but people ask me for my name and my address and identifying information. And obviously, if more than one person claims to be the same person, they would notice that. They would catch that if you're voting in person. In the mail, there are tracking numbers, there are signature matches, there are a lot of steps that the jurisdictions take to make sure that the ballot that they receive back comes from a legitimate registered voter and is the same person that they mailed the ballot out to. And indeed, by the way, there's some brand new reporting on this. Apparently, the FBI and DHS and a lot of folks who are involved in election security have had a press conference recently where they stated that there's been this story promoted that maybe foreign governments would be printing up mail-in ballots, and they have really dismissed that out of hand as a realistic possibility. That's not happening.
Well, how might you advise someone who is anxious about going to the polls to vote in person in the middle of a pandemic, but also anxious about their ballot potentially being delayed or lost, sending it in through the mail? What advice might you give someone in that position?
Well, first of all, vote early. It's not too early to check on your registration and make sure that you are, in fact, registered to vote. And then you want to request your absentee ballot. If you're planning on voting absentee, request your absentee ballot at the soonest possibility. It will be mailed to you. You don't actually have to mail it back. You can fill it out. If you want to mail it back, put it in the mail as soon as possible. I would say put it in the mail a good 2 weeks in advance of the election if you can do that. But if you're worried about it getting lost in the mail or the mail's being delayed, I think every jurisdiction has a way of hand delivering those ballots. In most places, you could hand deliver it in person on election day at the polling station, and you wouldn't have to wait in a long line. But perhaps even better than that is you could go early, go to the Board of Elections, go to vote.org or vote.gov, and you can find out where your local Board of Elections is and what the rules are for this. But you can almost always drop off a ballot at the Board of Elections, and many boards of elections also have secure drop boxes at various places in the community where you can also put your ballot in there. That's actually what I'm planning on doing. I'm planning on dropping off my ballot personally because I'm also worried about the mail.
And kind of in that same vein about local boards of elections, a lot of them are under a lot of strain to make sure their polling places are up to snuff, if you will, in terms of pandemic resiliency. What role do you see for the federal government in ensuring that local jurisdictions have the resources that they need to be able to continue to put on a safe election, people who still wish to vote in person?
Well, election administrators from across the country have really been begging Congress to send them money. It was estimated by the Brennan Center, a nonpartisan center associated with NYU, that earlier this year that it would cost an additional $4 billion for all of the election administration jurisdictions around the country to do what they needed to do to make sure that they have enough resources to run a what will be a ramped up mail-in voting operation this year because so many of the voters are demanding that. But in addition, to also maintain a safe space where people can vote in person. There are very few places where the voting will be exclusively by mail or even almost exclusively by mail. There are 5 jurisdictions that have been doing that way for years now. But in most places, you will have the option of coming in person or doing it by mail. And if you want to go in person, they're going to need bigger space. They're going to need to have all sorts of equipment to sanitize everything. They're going to need PPE for the poll workers. And all of this costs money. So it would be, still, I cling to the hope that Congress will appropriate more funds. They've appropriated about $400 million out of the $4 billion that was originally suggested. So they've got a long way to go to help the states out. Obviously, the states and localities are suffering from the same economic problems that the rest of the country is suffering from. Their tax base is shrinking. Their economies are in bad shape. So they really do need the money in order to do this. The other resource that states are and localities that are running the election are really in desperate need of is poll workers, because most poll workers historically have been senior citizens. That's who shows up. That's who's willing to give, their time to do this. So if any of you or your friends are you're young, and if you're feeling healthy and you're not in any risk group and you want to do something for your country, really sign up to be a poll worker with your local Board of Elections. You would be doing a great service to your democracy, because one of the reasons we saw these enormous lines in some places during the primaries is that they just did not have enough people to staff the number of polling places that they normally would stand up. So in some cities, instead of 180 polling places, they had 5. And that meant that there were many, many more people who had to show up to the same place, and the lines got really backed up. So there's a really desperate need for poll workers. And we are hoping that young people are going to rise to the challenge, because old people aren't going to be able to do it as much this year.
Mhm. And speaking of working the polls, being present to help facilitate a safe and secure election, the Carter Center, based out of Atlanta, has announced that for the first time, they are going to be participating in a US-based election monitoring effort, which is something they typically do around the globe and not in the United States. Do you share the concern of the Carter Center that, just the myriad circumstances we're facing right now may present some cause for concern or irregularities in this election?
Well, this is going to be a challenging election. There is no question about it. People may not realize this, but the United States has had election observers for a number of years now. Every year there's a delegation from Europe that comes and observes our election. And I have met with some of these delegations over the years. I've also participated in delegations that have gone abroad to observe other people's elections. There's nothing wrong with having observers come in and see whether you're doing things right, and maybe they can learn from how we're doing it as well. So I don't have any qualms about having observers in U.S. elections. There are usually domestic observers. I mean, there will be both Republicans and Democrats out there, as well as nonpartisan groups that will be out there just trying to make sure that everybody is able to vote fairly and accessibly. So I welcome the Carter Center's efforts. They know what they're doing when it comes to election observation.
And I'll go ahead and mention to our audience as well that I am nearing the end of my list of questions that I came prepared with. So we had aimed to hold about the second half of this event, which it looks like we'll be able to do, for questions from the audience. So you can either drop those in the chat box on the right side of your screen, or there is a small Q&A button below the panelist view here, where you can submit questions as well. So after this one, we will start getting to audience questions, a few of which have already trickled in. So you can go ahead and send those in as we're getting through the end of these questions right now. So something else, again, you're probably picking up that I follow your Twitter pretty closely.
I appreciate that.
With so many mail-in ballots expected this year, a really higher than average percentage of people are anticipated to be sending in their ballots by mail. How is watching the returns come in on election night going to be different in 2020?
Well, it's going to take longer to count all the absentee ballots. In 2016, about 1 in 4 voters voted absentee, which is probably higher maybe than some people expected. But there's nothing unusual about voting absentee. People do it every year. The military does it, has been doing it since the Civil War, in fact. It was Abraham Lincoln who invented absentee balloting because he didn't want to bring his soldiers home from the war in order to vote in their local jurisdictions. So we've been doing vote by mail for a very long time in this country. But a lot of states are going to be confronting many more absentee ballots than they are used to dealing with. I've seen estimates that roughly 3/4 of voters are eligible to vote by mail. A lot of states have changed their procedures this year in order to make it easier for people to vote by mail. Often there are excuses required in order to vote by mail, and a number of states have said, well, this year you don't have to worry about that. If you ask to vote by mail, we're going to assume you've got a good excuse. There are still some states, there's I think 9 states that you still need to have an excuse, and COVID-19 is not an automatic excuse. Not really sure why, but in most states throughout the country, it is going to be much easier to vote absentee, and a lot of people are going to choose that. Probably not 3/4, but I would guess maybe somewhere between half and up to 3/4. So the election officials are going to have to process all those ballots. There are a number of jurisdictions, including some in swing states, where they're not even allowed to start opening the envelopes and checking the signatures and doing the basic processing until election day or until the polls close. So if they're not even allowed to start processing the ballots until election day, they're not going to be finished with them on election night. And that is something that people really need to be prepared for. And I'm hoping that the media is going to be responsible in how they talk about this, because there's nothing wrong with waiting to get an accurate count. It doesn't mean that there's any funny business going on. There's nothing nefarious about this. This is just election officials who are professionals doing their job and meticulously counting every vote, which is what we want them to do.
We'll go ahead and jump to an audience question that's actually related to what you're just talking about right here from Jeffrey Kerm, asking for kind of your speculative timeline on how long you think that might take for them to put all these ballots together and get those numbers. And then I'll actually add an addendum to that question. Do you think that, you know, kind of delaying the certification of final results by days, weeks, you know, potentially even a month or so after election day heightens the risk that, you know, we end up with drawn out processes where candidates at the federal or even local level contest results?
Well, I think if candidates are going to contest the results, they're going to contest the results. And there are, in fact, contests every election. We usually don't hear about them. You know, there might be contests at the local level. There might be a couple of congressional seats that get contested. It's not unusual to have election contests. Excuse me, only once in 2000 did we have one that made it to the presidential level. And there have already been 160 lawsuits filed in connection with the election this year and the procedures and how different states are handling it. Some of them saying you need to open up more procedure to make it easier for votes. Some of them on the other side saying you've made it too liberal and easy for fraud to take place. As I said, I don't think fraud is really a major problem. So you know, there's a lot of lawyers out there. There's already a lot of litigation. Wouldn't shock me if there's more litigation to come. I think we should be prepared for anything from a few days to a few weeks of delay, possibly affecting the presidency, but possibly affecting other races that are important to people, key Senate races, other races at the state and local level. By mid-December, they're supposed to have this counting done so they can send the results in to Congress. There has been one bill introduced by Marco Rubio that follows on a suggestion that was made in a Washington Post op-ed by a conservative and a progressive, I think they're both either political scientists or political consultants, who said, why don't you extend that date from mid-December to, say, the beginning of January? Now, Congress, their terms expire on January 3rd, and they're sworn in on January 3rd. So any congressional races that aren't resolved by January 3rd, those seats are just going to remain vacant until the recount is resolved. The presidential term runs under the Constitution until midday, noon on January 20th. So if we didn't have a result by then, the current presidential term would be over nonetheless. So there's no way to extend the current presidential term beyond January 20th at noon. I'm reasonably confident it's going to be resolved by then. But, you know, there could be some hair-raising weeks in between the election and then.
Another question here from Kristen Heitkamp asking specifically about the FEC's oversight authority for violations of the Hatch Act as it pertains to electioneering by federal officials.
That is within the province of the Office of Special Counsel, which is a separate independent body. It is not part of the FEC. It's not. It's part of the executive branch, but it's its own little independent agency. So we don't have jurisdiction over Hatch Act violations.
And then we have a question here about absentee versus mail-in voting. I'll go ahead and read it aloud for everyone in the audience here as well. It's my understanding that absentee ballots are handled differently from mail-in ballots because of the way it's been suggested they're distributed without application. If all is well with absentee ballots, can we not, as we do now, allow anyone to vote absentee and open the polls to allow those who want to vote in person to vote?
Okay, so most voting experts use the term mail-in and absentee interchangeably. In fact, the president's campaign filed a brief in a lawsuit in Pennsylvania in which they use the term interchangeably. There's not a big difference, and every state calls it something different. It's just a matter of how the state describes it. These aren't really terms of art. What seems to be the difference that has been focused on is whether you have to affirmatively apply to vote absentee or whether the ballot is just going to be sent to all registered voters automatically. That's the way they do it in the 5 states where they've been doing virtually all mail-in balloting for a number of years now. They have very clean voter lists and they send the ballots out. You don't have to request them. That's done automatically. There are an additional 4 states that have said that they are going to send ballots out automatically to all registered voters. But the other 41 states, you have to apply for it. So that is the vast majority of states already require an application. So if that's the concern, that you want people to have to apply for a ballot, that's the way it's going to work in 41 states. There are only 9 states where they're going to send it out. As I said, 5 of the 9, they've been doing it this way for a long time. The other 4, probably California, Nevada, 2 more. I probably have it written down somewhere. But Nevada is the only one that's actually arguably a swing state out of those additional 4. So if people are, again, focused at the presidential level, probably not even much of a practical difference between the terms absentee and mail-in to the extent that people distinguish among those terms at all. So I wouldn't fixate on that too much. It's kind of a rabbit hole to go down and try and figure out why people use one term versus the other term.
So we've got another question here from Ida Adiwi, who is a 2L at Georgetown Law, hoping to pursue a career in political or election law, and is wondering if you have any advice for her or for other young people in the audience about how to get their foot in the door and about how you got started in this field.
Okay, well, I think that, there's nothing that beats just, doing it, right? So you can volunteer on campaigns. Certainly in a year like this, there are many opportunities for lawyers or even law students who want to volunteer to do a wide range of campaign work, and you get to know politicians that way, and politicians are often the way that they're the people who are in a position to hire lawyers to do campaign work. There are a number of law firms that are particularly well known for this. The party committees are also, both of the party committees are organizing a just vast number of volunteer lawyers. They're going to want to have observers in every state, particularly in the swing states. So I would say if, particularly as a law student, may not be able to get a paying job, but you can almost certainly get a volunteer, some kind of volunteer experience. And once you get some experience, then you can build on that and use that to try and get further work in the field. Once you get out of law school, obviously, then you can, while you're in law school, you could apply for summer jobs that are relevant to this, either at firms or at the FEC, or, working in related areas on the Hill with advocacy groups. And then, once you get out, there are there's opportunities all over the country for political lawyers. Corporations hire political lawyers to do compliance work. So I would think about, the nonprofit sphere, the for-profit sphere, law firms, government. There's, campaigns themselves. There are a lot of different ways of going about it. And then I think part of the question was how did I get there?
Yeah.
I started out of law school. I was working at a law firm, and then I moved to a job on the Hill. I was my first job in the political law field was at the House Ethics Committee, which I thought was really a blast. At that time, the Ethics Committee had its offices right in the Capitol, in the basement of the Capitol. So we were like literally in the belly of the beast. And every day I got to walk to work and see that beautiful dome. And, it got me every single time to think that I was working for the United States government, for the United States Congress, and I was helping to ensure integrity in government. Interestingly, I had been at a firm and I talked to a headhunter, and the headhunter said, what sort of law? I'd been doing just sort of general litigation. The headhunter said, what sort of law are you interested in specializing in? And I said, I really like ethics. I had done some work in Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I've done some work in professional ethics. And the headhunter at that time said to me, you can't get a job doing ethics law. That's not a thing. And the next job I got was at the House Ethics Committee because they were looking to beef up their staff, and I just sent in a resume cold. So part of my advice would be don't be deterred by people who say, there aren't jobs doing whatever it is you want to do, whether it's political law or anything else. Think outside the box and think creatively. I mean, this is a tough time to be looking for a job. I get that. This is just a challenging time in so many ways. But I think that you just have to put your head down, send out a ton of resumes, talk to everybody talk to everybody that they can refer you to talking to, do a lot of networking, and keep your eyes open. You never know where opportunities are going to come from.
And then we have another question here from, from Jeffrey Kern, asking about where the FEC gets most of its information in terms of enforcement tips. So specifically, this is in reference to potential foreign interference. So I suppose we can extrapolate also for just other enforcement actions as well. Do those typically come mainly from tips or individual reports? Is there any kind of collaboration with state level election authorities, other federal agencies on that kind of work? Or is that something that just has to come to y'all independently?
Most of our complaints, most of our enforcement docket is complaint driven. Anybody can file a complaint with the FEC. If they don't have anything more than a vague suspicion, it's probably not going to go very far. But if you've got some facts, they have to be, notarized. You have to have something that you're giving us to start with. But every single complaint is reviewed by our lawyers, and they come from everything from somebody overhearing something in a bar to people reading things in the newspaper. There are a number of frequent flyers on our complaint docket, groups that are, that call themselves good government groups. They're looking for information that looks suspicious to them to toss it to us to investigate. We do refer cases back and forth with other law enforcement agencies. Somebody else hears about something and that they think is more clearly in our bailiwick, or sometimes when we see somebody files a complaint with us and we realize, well, that's not really for us, it's for somebody else. So there certainly is a cooperative relationship amongst law enforcement agencies, but most of it just comes from people being aware and hearing something, seeing something. Sometimes you get people inside of an organization that see something that they're not comfortable with, and they'll file a complaint. Sometimes people will self-report. I mean, this is less likely in the foreign national area, but and sometimes people do make honest mistakes. I mean, even in this area, not everybody knows that even at the very local level, you're not allowed to accept money from foreign sources in any U.S. election. And, you know, we've had situations where people have said, you know, here's this mayoral candidate that accepted money from somebody who was not a U.S. citizen. And, you know, the response was, well, the person was living in my district, even though they weren't a U.S. citizen. I didn't know I wasn't allowed to accept that money from them. So, you know, people do make mistakes, and sometimes we will find, again, just speaking more generally, not necessarily limited to foreign nationals, sometimes an organization will acquire new management for one reason or another. The new managers come in and they take a look around and they say, doesn't look like the old managers were really running the place right, and they will self-report. They will file what we call a sua sponte, where they come to us and they say, okay, we think that something went wrong here. It's usually when there's a management turnover that we get these. We think the organization did something wrong. We're trying to clean it up. We want to get right with the law. And we often will give discounts on penalties, actually, for people who self-report, because we want to incentivize that. So if you come clean with the agency and say, oops, we messed up, there usually will be a lower penalty than if we find out about it on our own.
Yeah. And then another question from Mr. Kerm here about if state boards of elections routinely collaborate with the Postal Service on just regular assurance of absentee and mail voting, that's going to, you know, process cleanly and on time, or if this kind of recent summer slowdown in postal deliveries really came as a surprise to everybody.
Well, I think part of the problem is that, you know, there's sort of a lot of background noise. You know, if in another year, if the Postal Service had sent a letter out to all of the jurisdictions saying, hey, if you want to make sure that all your ballots get delivered on time, you know, you got to give us enough time. So you want to have your deadlines backed up enough so that we can ensure that we will deliver the mail on time. You know, maybe in another year, people would not have thought that much about it. But there's been so much else in the news about the Postal Service, about about mail-in voting, that everybody's instantly suspicious. I think that the Postal Service is capable of delivering the mail. You know, I wouldn't, like I said, do it early. I wouldn't, you know, you can't put your ballot in the mail the day before Election Day and assume that it's going to get there on time. But you know, the Postal Service delivers many more items of mail around Mother's Day, around the winter holidays. You know, there are peak seasons for mail, and the Postal Service usually gets the mail delivered. They have the capacity to do that. I believe they have the capacity to do that even now. I would like to see them get more funding because, you know, for larger reasons that have to do with making sure that everybody can get the mail, that not only in connection with the election, but, you know, people rely on the mail to get medicine and other important deliveries. But I think the capacity is there, again, as long as everybody gets their stuff in the mail early enough. And as I said, you know, do everything as early as possible. And if you're worried about it, drop it off in person.
We have another question here about if there are any statutory or administrative changes that you see as either feasible or practical that would ensure that the FEC is not left without a quorum in the future.
Well, I mean, they set up the agency so that they thought they were protecting it against situations like this when they wrote into the law that commissioners, we have terms, but we're allowed to serve beyond the end of our term until somebody else is appointed to replace us. And that provision is there specifically in order to make sure that we don't run out of commissioners. And for, you know, the FEC was put together was established in 1975, and there was not a period where we didn't have a quorum until 2008. I think that there's just been greater dysfunction in government in general over the last 10, 12 years, and a lot more polarization. Everything is a big fight. Some things that didn't used to be big fights are big fights now. Less desire for consensus. So I'm not exactly sure how you could write a law because, okay, three of my former colleagues decided to leave. They're not bound to stay, right? They can leave if they want to. They can resign if they want to. And I don't know how you force a president to make nominations or force the Senate to vote on those nominations. So I'm not sure there's a statutory fix for that problem.
I'm glad you mentioned that commissioners are allowed to serve beyond the expiration of their term until a successor is appointed, because if I'm not mistaken, you have served a longer period of time between the expiration of your term and the present than the original length of your term. Is that correct?
Well, that is true. That is true. I'm still not the longest serving commissioner ever.
Oh.
Members of the commission used to be subject to reappointment. We had 6-year terms, and we could get reappointed every 6 years. And indeed, one of my former colleagues was reappointed 3 times and served for 24 years and currently holds the record for a longest serving commissioner. I'm not even in the top 5. Somewhere along the way, Congress decided, actually, I think because a particular member of Congress wanted to get that particular member of the commission off the commission, that they would institute these term limits, saying that, nominally people could only serve for 6 years, but then, as I said, we can stay on until we get replaced. And basically what happened was Congress changed the law, but then decided they really didn't want to live with the change that they adopted. So they just let people stay on. There just has not been a lot of pressure to hold to the 1 6-year term limit. They could replace me tomorrow. Fine. But, I don't want to leave without a replacement, because then that's just puts the commission further in the hole.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And then I will go ahead and ask one more question of you, and then we'll wrap a little early and let everybody get to dinner. You mentioned a little earlier about, really being excited for young people to step up and take a more active role in the selection, working as poll workers, doing what they can to really fill the gap that's left by kind of this weird political situation that we're in right now. What would you say to young people who are really disillusioned with politics, with our electoral system, with, the influence of government in everyday life? It's really difficult to look around and think that our system is working really well. What do you say to those young people to keep them interested and engaged with the kind of work that you do?
Well, you can throw up your hands and be apathetic and walk away, but you're not going to improve the system that way. If you want to have a voice, you start by voting. You start by getting involved. You start by getting more engaged and engaging with your elected officials. If you don't like what you see, find other candidates that you would like to support and try and talk them into running, or consider running for office yourself. There are, probably the people on this call are too young to run for Congress, but there are, other positions that one could run for. I will tell you that politicians do pay attention to who turns out and votes. They pay attention to who gives money, they do, but they also pay attention to who votes. And if they see an entire age cohort that just doesn't turn out and vote, they say, fine, we don't have to worry about their concerns. So you are not going to enhance your power, your ability to make change by sitting on your hands and staying home. Because the people who won't stay home are your grandparents generation. They love to vote. They turn out in vast numbers. Let me see, I think I actually have somewhere around here some sort of what I find alarming statistics about this. So in in 2018, which was supposed to be a banner year for midterm turnout. It was the highest turnout in 100 years for a midterm election, and it was just under 50% of all of the eligible voters. And that was, people were all excited about that. Of that group, that less than 50%, if you look at the over 65 and older range, roughly 66% turned out and voted, 2/3 of them. But if you look at 18 to 29-year-olds, only 36% turned out and voted in the midterm election. Go back to, if you're, motivated by presidential elections, go back to 2016, 71% of 65 and olders voted, and 46% of 18 to 29-year-olds voted. So this is, this tells something to politicians. This is why for years, for decades, Social Security has been the third rail of politics, where, no politician ever wants to touch Social Security because they'll anger the older voters. Student loan debt, not as important to politicians because they don't think the people who are most affected by that are going to hold them accountable. The only way you can actually hold politicians accountable is at the ballot box. And if you don't think that midterms matter, I mean, this is a presidential year. I think it's an important election. I hope everybody's going to turn out and vote. If you don't think that midterms matter, let me tell you about 2014, when we had the lowest turnout in since World War II. 2014 overall, the turnout was 36.4%, which is just amazing to me. Over 60% of eligible voters didn't bother. In that really low turnout year, and amongst 18 to 29-year-olds, only 20% bothered to turn out and vote that year. In that really low turnout year, the Senate flipped. Senate switched hands from Democratic control to Republican control. As a result of that, in 2016, when Antonin Scalia passed away and Barack Obama was in a position to nominate his successor, it was Mitch McConnell who was in charge of the Senate, and he decided that he wasn't going to give a vote to President Obama's nominee. Now, you might think that what resulted from that is terrific, or you might think it's terrible. Either way, it was hugely consequential to the future of the court and to the future of decisions that are going to affect all of you more than me, going forward in your lives. And these decisions were made based on a Congress that was elected in an election where 60% just sat home and didn't bother to vote. You never know when something important is going to happen, and you never know when there's going to be a pandemic, and you're going to want to have really competent people running the government and making decisions. It's to not vote in any election is abdicating your vote and your voice and your ability to hold people accountable and to expect them to pay attention to what you say and to what your needs are and your concerns are. And sometimes people say, well, I don't want to have to choose between the lesser of two evils. Well, the problem with that is that then you could end up with the greater of two evils, and that doesn't seem like a good plan. You wouldn't let your grandparents choose your music or your clothing or your boyfriends or girlfriends. Why would you let them choose your government? Take charge. This country needs the energy and enthusiasm and ideas of your generation. And I really hope that you all are going to step up and sign up to be poll workers. Make sure you vote. Turn out your friends. Turn out your cousin that you hate to talk to. Turn out everybody you know, because this is how we get consent of the governed. The Declaration of Independence says that the government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. This is how you give your consent, by voting. This is how we make it a government of the people, by the people, for the people. This is how our representative democracy represents all of us. All of us need to do our civic duty. It's, once every couple of years, get out and vote.
Well, Commissioner Weintraub, thank you so much for your time this evening. It's been a lot of fun getting to talk with you. I'm sure many of you in our audience will have as much fun following her on Twitter as I do after this evening. So again, thank you so much for being with us. I hope that one day our world has calmed down enough that we'll be able to actually properly welcome you to campus. But until then, thank you so much. And everyone, I will dismiss this class so everybody can get back to their dinners for the evening. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you too. If you want to follow me on Twitter, it's Ellen L. Weintraub. You got to get the middle initial in there, or you can be following a realtor in California, I think. And it's really been a pleasure. As you know, I came to UNC a couple of years ago, and I would be delighted to come back someday and meet you all in person.
Well, perfect. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.